Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are turning our attention to a figure who occupies a very strange, almost paradoxical space in modern history.
Mhm.
We're talking about a man who spent his life dealing with, the most solitary, quiet, and introspective of craftswriting poetry, but who somehow ended up with the kind of visibility and, well, public adoration that we usually associate with pop culture
It
icons.
is a paradox, isn't it? I mean, usually when we talk about famous poets in the 20th or 21st century, we mean famous within the academy.
Right, famous to people who have master's degrees in English.
Exactly.
Right.
But today we're talking about Seamus Heaney, and he was famous in a way that just spilled over the edges of the literary world entirely.
That's actually where I want to start. One of the things that really struck me when we were preparing for this is this specific term that popped up in the 90s, Heaney boppers.
Heaney boppers. It's brilliant. Just the sound of it.
It sounds like a joke, but it wasn't. It was a real phenomenon. You had these readings, specifically around the time he was teaching at Oxford, where people were queuing around the block.
History.
And it wasn't just, dutiful students with notepads. It was fans. They were clamoring to get into these lecture halls just to hear him read verse. That image of a poet generating that kind of electric excitement, it feels like a glitch in the Matrix.
It does, but it speaks to the specific magnetism Heaney had. I mean, by the time he died in 2013, he was widely considered the most famous poet in the world.
Without question.
But the danger with that kind of celebrity, especially for a writer, is that the image can eclipse the work. He becomes the lovable Irish bard with the shock of white hair, and people forget the sheer intellectual steel and the complexity involved in getting there.
Right, and that's the mission for this deep dive. We aren't just here to celebrate the famous guy. We want to understand the mechanics of that journey, because on paper, this just doesn't make sense.
Not at all.
He was born in 1939, the son of a cattle dealer in County Derry. He grew up in a house with no electricity. He was destined, statistically speaking, to be a farmer or a tradesman.
Absolutely. The trajectory from a farm in Castle Dawson to the podium in Stockholm accepting the Nobel Prize is not a straight line. It is a path full of fractures, political violence, and intense personal negotiation.
And negotiation seems to be the key word. He wasn't just negotiating his own career, he was negotiating a war zone. He was writing during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. He was constantly being pulled by different factions. Speak for us, denounce them, take a side.
And that is the crucible. How do you remain an artist when your community is demanding you become a propagandist? That's really the central tension of his life.
It has to be.
But what I love about digging into Heaney is that despite all this heavy political weight, the man himself, the personality, remained incredibly grounded. We have sources that talk about how he called the Nobel Prize the end thing to avoid sounding arrogant.
The end thing, which is such a specific kind of humility. It's not false modesty. It's almost like a protective mechanism.
It is. It's about keeping it real, keeping it manageable in his own head.
But let's rewind. Let's go back to the soil, literally. To understand the poet, we have to understand where he stood.
We have to go to Mossbawn. That was the name of the family farmhouse in County Londonderry. He was born there in 1939, the first of 9 children.
The first of 9, wow.
And Mossbawn isn't just a location. In Heaney's work, it's almost a mythical landscape. He called it his omphalos, the navel of the world. Everything started there.
And that world was defined by his parents. But looking at the background here, it seems like his mother and father weren't just two different people. They represented two completely different cultures, almost two different timelines coexisting in one house.
That is a crucial observation. I think you've hit the nail on the head. If you look at his father, Patrick Heaney, he is the archetype of the old rural Gaelic world.
The cattle dealer.
The cattle dealer. He was a man of silence. Heaney writes about his father not really speaking, but communicating through presence, through the handling of animals, through the rhythm of the seasons. He was deeply connected to the earth.
And then there's the mother, Margaret Kathleen McCann. She wasn't from the farm originally.
No, and that's the clash. Her family, the McCanns, were from the linen mill country. They were industrialized. To Heaney, his mother represented the modern world. She represented speech. She was articulate. She was anxious. She was connected to the busyness of the town and the mill.
So you have the father representing silence, nature, and the past, and the mother representing speech, industry, and the present.
Exactly. And Heaney is the product of that collision. He famously said that his poetry came from the tension between his father's silence and his mother's speech. He was constantly trying to bridge those two worlds.
Which explains so much about his style.
It does. It's why his poetry is so physical, is the mud of the father, but it's also so articulate and crafted. It has the speech of the mother,
It's almost like he was genetically engineered to be a translator between worlds. But it wasn't just a philosophical childhood. There was a specific event, a tragedy, that really ruptured that early innocence. I think for many listeners, this might be the first Heaney poem they ever encountered in school.
I'd bet on it. You're thinking of midterm break.
Yes. The context here is just brutal. Heaney is 12 years old. He's just won a scholarship to St. Columb's College, which is a boarding school in Derry.
So he's already left the farm. He's already in that process of being educated out of his class, which is a lonely position to be in.
Incredibly lonely. But then, in February 1953, while he is away at school, his younger brother Christopher is killed.
Christopher was only 4.
4 years old, hit by a car on the road near their home, and Heaney has to come back from school, this strange, educated boy, to face this raw, rural tragedy.
The poem Midterm Break is so famous, but I think because it's often taught in schools, we can sometimes gloss over just how devastating the craftsmanship is.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a weeping, wailing poem.
No, and that's the power of it. It's clinical. It's almost like a reporter's notebook. He describes sitting in the sick bay at school, counting bells, nulling classes to a close, waiting for his neighbors to pick him up.
The detachment is chilling.
It is. He describes the ambulance arrival. He describes the old men shaking his hand and saying they're sorry for his trouble. It's all very observed, very detached.
Until he goes into the room with the coffin.
Right. And even then, it's about observation. He sees his father crying, which is a shock because his father is this stoic cattle dealer. But then he looks at the body of his brother. He notes the poppy bruise on his left temple. He notes that there are no gaudy scars because the bumper knocked him clear.
It's that refusal to look away from the detail. But the ending, the math of the ending.
It's what makes the whole thing land.
A 4-foot box, a foot for every year.
It creates a silence. You read that line, and there is nothing else to say. Snaps the box shut. It shows that even at the very beginning of his writing life, Heaney understood that you don't generate emotion by telling people, I was sad. You generate emotion by showing the cold, hard facts of the loss, the measurement of the coffin.
That tragedy seems to hang over a lot of his work, but Midterm Break is the one that really punches you in the gut. Later on, he wrote The Blackbird of Glanmore, which returns to this, right?
Yes, much later in his life. He revisited that loss. In The Blackbird of Glanmore, he connects the memory of his brother to a blackbird he sees on his land in Wicklow. It's less raw, perhaps, but it shows that the grief never really leaves. It just changes shape.
It becomes part of the landscape of his mind.
Exactly.
So he has this grief and he has this education. He's moving further and further away from the cattle-dealing life of his father. This brings us to the central metaphor of his early career. I think digging is probably the poem that defines his mission statement.
It is his manifesto. Without a doubt. You have to imagine the anxiety he must have felt. He comes from a line of men who worked with their hands. His grandfather cut turf on the bog. His father handled cattle.
Real physical labor.
Right. And here is Seamus, holding a pen, reading Latin, studying literature. There is a deep sense of almost betrayal. Is he betraying his class? Is he betraying his masculinity?
That's a very real imposter syndrome. My dad is out there sweating in the fields, and I'm in here trying to find a rhyme for flower.
Exactly. And in digging, he confronts that head on. He looks out the window and sees his father digging in the flower beds, and he remembers his grandfather digging turf. He describes the sound, the nicking and slicing, the clean rasping sound of the spade sinking into the gravelly ground. He admires the skill of it, the rhythm.
But then he looks at his own hand.
He looks at the pen, and he has this realization. He says, I've no spade to follow men like them. He accepts that he cannot do what they did. He isn't that man. But then he pivots.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
And that is the moment everything changes. He reframes writing not as this airy-fairy high intellectual pursuit, but as a form of digging. He's going to use the pen to excavate. He is going to dig into the past, dig into the culture, dig into the memory. Just like his father dug into the soil, it validates his art as labor.
It's such a powerful way to bridge that gap. He's telling himself and his family, I'm still working. I'm just working a different seam.
And that metaphor of digging, of going down, of unearthing, it becomes the method for his entire career. He is an archaeologist of the self and of Ireland.
So he commits to the pen. He heads to Queen's University, Belfast in 1957. This is the late 50s, early 60s. What was the atmosphere like for a young poet there? I assume the syllabus was very English.
Incredibly English. You study the canon, Shakespeare, Milton, Wordsworth, Keats. And for a young Irish Catholic from a rural background, there was this subtle, pervasive message that Real literature happened elsewhere.
Oh.
It happened in London or the Lake District. It didn't happen in County Derry. Your local life, the barns, the bogs, the dialect, that wasn't poetic. That was just backward.
So how did he break out of that? How did he realize that his own life was worth writing about?
It didn't happen in a vacuum. He was reading widely, of course. But the spark, funnily enough, came from a British poet, Ted Hughes.
Ted Hughes, who wrote The Iron Man and was married to Sylvia Plath.
That's the one. Heaney read a collection by Hughes called Lupercal. And Hughes was writing about the countryside, but not in a polite, pastoral way. He was writing about the violence of nature, the mud, the blood, the raw vitality of animals.
It wasn't daffodils dancing in the breeze.
No, it was pikes in a pond eating each other. It was a hawk tearing his prey apart. And Heaney read this and said, wait a minute, this sounds like my life.
Oh.
He realized that his own local County Derry experience, which he thought was unliterary, was actually a gold mine.
Wow.
He said reading Hughes was like hearing his own voice being validated. It gave him permission.
That's a massive confidence hurdle to clear, to realize that your boring background is actually art.
It is. And he wasn't doing it alone. This is where we have to talk about the Belfast group.
This sounds like a band, but it was a workshop, right?
It was a writers' group, yeah. Organized by a man named Philip Hobsbawm in 1963. Hobsbawm was a lecturer at Queen's, and he brought together these young writers, Heaney, Derek Mahan, Michael Longley. They would meet, drink coffee, and probably other things, and critique each other's work.
Having that peer group must have been essential. Iron sharpening iron.
Crucial.
Yeah.
They pushed each other. They were competitive, sure, but they were also a support network. They were, in effect, defining a new Northern Irish poetry.
And Heaney also had a mentor figure, Michael McLaverty.
He did. McLaverty was a headmaster at the school where Heaney taught for a bit, St. Thomas's Secondary School.
Right.
And McLaverty was an established writer himself, a novelist. He took Heaney under his wing. He introduced him to the poetry of Patrick Kavanagh. Now, Kavanagh is important because he was an Irish rural poet who wrote about the grim realities of farming, the bachelor farmers, the stony gray soil. McLaverty basically told Heaney, look at Kavanagh, you can do this. Your world is valid.
So he has the permission from Hughes, he has the peers in the Belfast group, and he has the mentor in McLaverty. The pieces are all falling into place.
They are. He starts publishing. He gets married to Marie Devlin in 1965, who was a writer herself, right?
She was. She published a collection of Irish myths called Over 9 Waves. So he was marrying into an intellectual equal, someone who understood the craft.
Absolutely. And then in 1966, the big one, Death of a Naturalist comes out. This is his first major collection with Faber and Faber, which was and is the most prestigious poetry publisher in the UK.
And it lands with a splash.
It was an immediate success. It won the Gregory Award, the Geoffrey Faber Prize. Critics loved it. But what they loved was that it felt real. This brings us to the concept of naturalism.
Yeah, let's pause there. We use these terms like naturalism and romanticism. Can we break that down? If you're a listener who hasn't touched a poetry textbook in 20 years, what's the difference?
Okay, broadly speaking, romanticism, think Wordsworth or Keats, often looks at nature as a source of beauty, spiritual renewal, or sublime awe. Nature is a place you go to feel good or to feel God.
It's idealized.
In a way, yes. Naturalism, on the other hand, looks at nature as a physical system. It includes the rot, the decay, the slime, the biological processes. It doesn't try to make it pretty.
So romanticism is the sunset over the mountains. Naturalism is the maggot in the dead sheep.
Vivid, but yes. That's a very good way of putting it.
Yeah.
And Heaney's Death of a Naturalist is full of that stuff.
Yeah.
He writes about soggy pea, potato mold, frog spawn. He writes about the childhood realization that nature isn't just cute animals, it's threatening and gross and alive.
There's that famous title poem, Death of a Naturalist, where the frogs essentially turn on him. He loves collecting the frog spawn, but then the adult frogs come back.
They gather in the flax dam, like mud grenades. He describes them as gross-bellied. Their slack throats pulsed like sails. It's terrifying.
It is.
It's the loss of childhood innocence through the encounter with the gross biological reality of the world. And critics found this incredibly refreshing because it felt honest. It smelled of the earth.
So he's established. He's the country poet. He's the guy who writes about digging frogs. But the world around him is changing. We are moving into the late 60s. The civil rights movement is starting in Northern Ireland. The tension is building.
And this is where the story gets darker. The Troubles didn't just happen in the background. They tore through the fabric of the society Heaney was living in. He couldn't ignore it.
For our listeners who might need a quick refresher, The Troubles were a 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland. Roughly speaking, you had the Unionists, who were mostly Protestant and wanted to remain in the UK, and the Nationalists were Republicans, mostly Catholic, who wanted a united Ireland. And it got incredibly violent.
Car bombs, assassinations, checkpoints, hunger strikes. It was a low-level civil war. And Heaney was a prominent Catholic from Derry. The pressure on him was immense.
From both sides.
From all sides.
Yeah.
His community, the nationalist community, expected him to speak for them, to use his platform to denounce British oppression.
But on the other side, if he spoke too stridently, he'd be written off as a propagandist for the IRA by the British media and the Unionist community.
Exactly. He was walking a tightrope. He was accused by some Republicans of being an apologist or too passive because he didn't write explicit up-the-rebels poetry.
Right.
But he was also viewed with suspicion by the British establishment.
He had that quote about permitting the situation. What did he mean by that?
You don't have to love it. You just have to permit it. He meant you have to allow the reality of the violence to enter your consciousness in your work. You can't pretend it isn't happening, but he refused to be a rabble-rouser.
There's the example of Requiem for the Croppies. That poem is a key moment in this whole dilemma.
It is a key moment. He wrote this poem in 1966 for the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising. But the poem is about the 1798 rebellion. It describes the rebels, the Croppies, fighting with pikes against the British cannons.
And it ends with that incredibly powerful image.
Yes. The rebels were carrying barley in their pockets for food, and when they were buried in mass graves, the barley grew up out of the ground. He ends the poem with, "And in August the barley grew up out of the grave."
It's a powerful image of resilience. The people die, but the resistance grows back. It's easy to see how that could be taken as a call to arms in 1966.
And it was. But Heaney read that poem to mixed audiences, Catholics and Protestants. And he insisted that reading it wasn't an incitement to violence. He called it silence breaking.
Silence breaking.
He was giving voice to a historical grief and a historical resistance, but he wasn't telling people to go out and plant a bomb today.
That distinction between silence breaking and incitement is so subtle, but it's everything. But eventually the pressure became too much, or at least the environment became too stifling. In 1972, he moved.
He moved his family south, to Wicklow, in the Republic of Ireland. He left the war zone to write full-time. Some people criticize this as running away.
I can imagine.
But artistically it was necessary. And it led to his most controversial and perhaps most brilliant collection, North, which came out in 1975.
This is where we get the bog poems. And this is where the digging metaphor goes from being about turf to being about, well, bodies.
It's a fascinating pivot. Heaney had been reading a book by a Danish archaeologist named P.V. Glob called The Bog People. It was full of these incredible photographs of Iron Age bodies that had been preserved in the peat bogs of Denmark.
Peat is an amazing preservative. It's anaerobic, right? It tans the skin like leather.
Yes. These bodies look like they are sleeping. You can see their eyelashes. But they weren't just people who fell in. They were ritual sacrifices.
They were murdered.
They were. They had their throats cut or they were strangled. They were killed by their tribes to appease the goddess of the earth, usually during times of crisis or winter.
And Heaney looks at these 2,000-year-old sacrificial victims and sees Belfast.
That is the leap of genius. He sees a parallel between the tribal violence of the Iron Age and the sectarian violence of the 1970s. He looks at a poem like The Tollin Man or The Groball Man. He describes the violence done to their bodies with incredible forensic detail.
Why make that connection? Is he saying we haven't changed? Is it that bleak?
In a way, yes. He's suggesting that the violence in Northern Ireland wasn't just about modern politics or civil rights. He was tapping into a darker, deeper current. He was suggesting that this is a recurring human tragedy, the need for a tribe to have a scapegoat, the need to sacrifice someone to the territory.
That is deeply disturbing. It takes the conflict out of the realm of politics that can be solved and into the realm of ritual that just repeats.
It is disturbing, and it was controversial. The critic Ciaran Carson famously called him the Laureate of violence, a myth maker, an anthropologist of ritual killing. Some people accused him of mythologizing the violence, of making it seem inevitable or beautiful rather than a political problem that could be solved.
It's a heavy charge.
It is. But Heaney was trying to find a framework to understand the horror without just shouting slogans. He was trying to find a container for the blood.
He was using the distance of history 2,000 years to get close to the trauma of the present.
Precisely.
But while he was doing this deep anthropological work, he was also dealing with the day-to-day politics of who he was. There's a lighter, sharper moment in 1982 involving a poetry anthology.
Ah, yes. The Penguin Book of Contemporary British Poetry. The editors, Blake Morrison and Andrew Motion, included Heaney. Now, from their perspective, this was an honor. You are one of the great poets of these islands. Join the club.
But Heaney is an Irish nationalist. Being called British is complicated.
It's not just complicated. For him, it's an erasure of his identity. It's a political act. So he wrote a pamphlet called An Open Letter. And in it, he wrote these famous lines.
He advised, "My passport's green. No glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen."
It's such a polite burn. It's so Heaney.
It is. It's witty. He's not screaming. He even acknowledges in the poem that he has British friends and that English is his medium. But he draws a line in the sand. He says, "My constitutional status might be ambiguous, but my cultural identity is not."
It's him asserting control over his own label. He refused the UK Poet Laureateship for the same reason later on.
He did.
But he did it with grace. He wasn't anti-British people. He was anti-imperial assumption. He once said, "I had lunch at the palace once upon a time." He could navigate those worlds, but he knew where he stood.
So as we move into the 80s and 90s, Heaney becomes this truly global figure. He's teaching at Harvard. He's the professor of poetry at Oxford. This is the era of the Heaney boppers.
The fame really did reach a fever pitch. He was straddling the Atlantic. He was a professor at Harvard from 1981 to 2006. So he became a major figure in American letters, too. He was the voice of Ireland for the world.
And that culminates in 1995 with the Nobel Prize in Literature.
The biggest prize in literature. The one that changes your life forever.
I love the story of how he found out because it's so un-Hollywood. It feels very true to his character.
It's perfect. He was in Greece on holiday with Marie. This was before everyone had a smartphone in their pocket. The Nobel Committee was frantically trying to call him, but he was just away, out of touch.
I can just imagine the Swedish Academy sweating, wondering if he's going to pick up the phone.
Eventually, a journalist tracks him down. He lands at Dublin Airport 2 days later, and the world is waiting. The media scrum is insane.
And his reaction is just so grounded. The citation praised his works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth. That's heavy stuff. But when asked how he felt about joining the list of Irish winners, Yeats, Shaw, Beckett, he said, "It's like being a little foothill at the bottom of a mountain range."
A little foothill. That is serious humility.
It is. And privately, as we said, he called it the end thing. Did you sort out the end thing? It was a way of domesticating the glory. He didn't want the prize to separate him from his friends or his roots. He wanted to remain Seamus.
He was intensely aware of the danger of that kind of thing. He didn't want it to puff him up.
But despite the foothill comment, the world didn't see him that way. The critic Robert Lowell called him the most important Irish poet since Yeats. That is the crown.
It is. And arguably, Heaney was more beloved than Yeats. Yeats was aristocratic, distant, mystical. Heaney was the farmer's son. He was approachable. You felt like you could have a pint with Seamus Heaney.
You wouldn't necessarily want a pint with Yeats. He might cast a spell on you or talk about fairies.
That's exactly.
Yeah. So he wins the Nobel. He's achieved everything a poet can possibly achieve. You'd think he might relax. But in 1999, he does something incredibly risky and, as it turns out, incredibly popular. He publishes a translation of Beowulf.
Beowulf, the bane of high school English students everywhere. An old English epic about monsters and dragons. Not exactly a page-turner for most people.
Why did he do it? And why did it become a bestseller? I mean, it beat Harry Potter on the bestseller lists at one point. That's insane.
The success comes down to voice. Heaney realized that he didn't have to write it in standard English. He realized that the Old English language, the language of the Anglo-Saxons, had a taproot that connected to the dialect he grew up with in Ulster.
How so? Can you give an example?
Well, in Northern Ireland, the English spoken there is infused with Scots and Gaelic.
Yeah.
But it also retains old archaic words that have died out in standard British English. He gives the example of the word thole.
Thole. Thole.
Yes, it means to suffer, to endure. I couldn't thole it. Heaney grew up hearing his aunt say that. And he found that word in Beowulf. So he realized that his own local voice was actually the perfect instrument to translate this ancient poem.
So he translated Beowulf into Ulster English.
In a way, he used the cadence and the vocabulary of his childhood. The very first word of the poem in Old English is quite. Traditionally, translators rendered this as hark, or listen, or lo.
Very King James Bible. Very formal.
Extremely formal. Heaney translated white as so.
So. Just. So.
The Spear Danes in Days Gone By. It's conversational. It sounds like a man in a pub in County Derry slapping the table and starting a story. So let me tell you this. Grab the reader immediately. It took the poem out of the museum and put it back in the mouth.
That is a brilliant example of what we talked about earlier, trusting his own background. He didn't try to sound like an Oxford Don, he sounded like a Heaney.
Exactly. He reclaimed the English language by showing that his version of it was just as valid and perhaps more powerful than the standard version.
This openness to language brings me to a detail I absolutely love. We have the Nobel Prize winner, the Oxford professor, the translator of Beowulf, talking about Eminem.
Yes.
Yeah.
In 2003, it was a wonderful moment.
Heaney praised Eminem. He said Eminem sent a voltage around a generation.
He was fascinated by the verbal energy. And you can see why. Heaney wasn't a snob. He didn't care if the words were in a leather-bound book or a rap song. If the words had power, if they had rhythm, if they had alliteration and assonance, if they moved people, he respected it.
Voltage is a great word for it. It implies a physical shock.
And that's what Heaney always wanted poetry to be. Not a puzzle to be solved, but a physical experience, a shock to the system.
We should also mention his theater work. He wasn't just a poet.
No, he wrote adaptations of Greek tragedies. The Cure at Troy, based on Sophocles' Philoctetes, is the most famous. It has that line about the moment when hope and history rhyme. But in 2004, he wrote The Burial at Thebes, which is an adaptation of Sophocles' Antigone.
And this wasn't just an academic exercise either, was it?
No, it was 2004, the Iraq War, the Bush administration. Antigone is a play about a woman who defies the state, King Creon, to bury her brother. It's about the clash between personal conscience and state power.
And Heaney saw parallels.
Clear parallels between Creon's rigid, uncompromising stance and the Bush-Blair rhetoric of "you are either with us or against us." He was using the classics to comment on the present again, just like he did with the Bog poems.
He never stopped engaging with the world. But the world eventually catches up with all of us. In 2006, he had a major health scare.
He did. He suffered a stroke. He was in Donegal, staying with his friend, the playwright Brian Friel. He woke up and couldn't move his leg. He was rushed to the hospital.
And even in the ambulance, the wit was there.
Laughs. It's incredible. He recounts that when the paramedics were attaching the heart monitor, he looked at them and said, "Blessed are the pacemakers."
That is incredible. A pun on the Sermon on the Mount while you're having a stroke.
It just shows his mind was still firing on all cylinders. But the stroke shook him badly. He wrote about feeling babyish, crying easily, feeling the fragility of his body. It changed his work. His 2010 collection, Human Chain, is very different from his earlier stuff.
How so? What's the shift?
It's lighter, it's airier, it's almost ghostly. The critic Colm Toibin called it a book of shades and memories. He writes about his parents again, but this time it's about trying to help his father get up from the bed, or remembering the weight of his wife's hand. It's a book about holding on to human connection before you let go.
Human chain. We are all linked.
Exactly. Hand to hand. It's a very tender, very mortal book.
Which brings us to the end. August 2013. Heaney is 74. He's recovered from the stroke. He's still active, still traveling.
He went for dinner with Marie and a friend in Dublin. He fell outside the restaurant. It seemed like a minor fall, but he was taken to the Blackrock Clinic for observation.
And the next morning, he was gone.
A ruptured artery in his aorta. It was sudden. And the reaction was just global grief. The funeral was broadcast live on Irish television. You had politicians like Bill Clinton, rock stars like Bono, poets and farmers all mourning him.
But the thing that everyone remembers, the thing that still gives me chills, is the final message.
This is the moment that elevates his story into something almost spiritual. Minutes before he was taken to the operating theater, minutes before he died, he sent a text message to his wife, Marie.
She wasn't in the room with him.
She was on her way or just outside. He was alone for a moment, and he typed 2 words in Latin. Noli timor.
Noli timor.
Be not afraid.
Why Latin, and why that phrase?
Well, the Latin is the language of his education, the language of the Catholic Church of his childhood, the language of the classics. It was deep in his hard drive. But the sentiment, be not afraid, it appears in the Bible when angels appear to humans. It appears when Jesus walks on water. It is the ultimate message of reassurance from the beyond.
It's devastatingly beautiful. He's facing his own death, the terrifying unknown, and his final act is to comfort his wife, to tell her not to be afraid.
It encapsulates his entire character. He was a man of immense duty and immense love, and he used his final breath, or his final thumbs, to try to make it easier for the person he loved.
It also feels like a message to us, to his readers.
I think so. I think it has to be. He spent his life looking at the bog bodies, the violence, the gaudy scars, the coffins. He didn't shy away from the darkness. But his final conclusion wasn't despair. It was courage. Noli timor.
That courage is literally carved in stone now. We have to talk about his epitaph. He's buried in Bellaghy, right?
Why? Back in the earth of County Derry. back where he started. And the headstone bears a line from one of his poems, The Gravel Walks.
Walk on air against your better judgment.
I love this line, walk on air against your better judgment. It's so optimistic, but also so realistic.
Let's unpack that. Better judgment is sensible. It's gravity. It's logic. It's what keeps you safe.
Better judgment is what tells you to keep your head down, to not take risks, to stay on the ground. But Heaney is telling us to defy that, to walk on air, to allow ourselves to feel joy, to feel uplift, to trust in art and the spirit, even when the world tells us it's foolish.
It connects back to the Heaney boppers, doesn't it? The excitement he generated. He lifted poetry off the page and made it walk on air for a while.
He did. He proved that poetry wasn't just for the classroom. It was for life. It was a survival mechanism. He believed it should be transformative, not just a printout of reality.
And his legacy is still growing. The Seamus Heaney home place in Bellaghy is a huge visitor center now, and there's a new book coming in 2025.
Yes, The Poems of Seamus Heaney. It's going to be the definitive collection, including uncollected works. So we aren't done learning from him yet.
I think it's the perfect place to land. We've gone from the boy at Mossbawn listening to the wind in the chimney to the Nobel Laureate telling the world, be not afraid.
It's a journey that shows the power of paying attention. Heaney paid attention to the small things, the spade, the pen, the blackbird. And through them, he understood the world. He made the local universal.
So here is the takeaway for you listening. We live in a world that is loud, often violent, and full of better judgment telling us to be cynical.
It's very easy to be cynical. It's the default setting.
But Heaney challenges us to dig deeper, to trust our own voice, our own local experience, and ultimately to walk on air. My challenge to you today, read one Heaney poem. Don't analyze it for a grade. Just read it. Read postscript, read digging, read midterm break, listen to the sound of it.
Let the voltage hit you.
Exactly. And maybe for a moment, you'll feel that reassurance, that courage. No lead timer. Thanks for digging with us today. We'll see you on the next deep dive.